My husband walked out of the luxury boutique while I was paying for his anniversary gift. Just a few more minutes. He smiled, kissing my cheek. I will pull the car around. I waited at the counter. Then the store manager approached me, her face pale, and whispered, "Ma'am, please come with me. My name is Maya. I am 32 years old and the CEO of a highly successful tech design agency." I thought I had the perfect life, but I was about to discover the devastating truth about the man I loved. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic people who underestimated your worth. I stood inside the pristine walls of the luxury high-end boutique, breathing in the scent of polished leather and expensive citrus cologne. The ambient lighting caught the brilliant sparkle of the diamond-encrusted watch resting on the velvet tray in front of me. It was a beautiful masterpiece carrying a hefty price tag that would make most people gasp. But for me, it was simply a token of appreciation for Julian, my husband, of 4 short years. He presented himself as a driven entrepreneur, and I loved spoiling him. I had built my design agency from the ground up, landing massive contracts with top tech giants across the country, and I truly believed Julian and I were a power couple building our business empire. I handed my solid metal black card to the cashier, smiling as Julian squeezed my shoulder. "I will go grab the Porsche and bring it to the front," he said, his voice smooth and reassuring. "It is raining a bit, and I do not want you ruining those beautiful shoes." He kissed my cheek, leaving a lingering warmth, and strolled out the glass doors. I watched his tailored suit disappear into the busy gray afternoon, feeling a deep, undeniable swell of genuine pride. The cashier slid my card through the machine. A soft beep echoed over the quiet hum of classical music playing in the store. The young woman frowned, tapping the screen of the register. "I am sorry, ma'am," she said politely. "It seems the card was declined." I laughed, brushing it off as a simple bank error. "That is impossible," I replied. "Please try it again. The account has more than enough funds." She swiped it a second time. Another flat beep. The screen flashed the same rejection. My heart did a strange, uncomfortable flutter. This was a card with an exceptionally high limit, one I used for major corporate expenses and luxury purchases. It had never been declined. Before I could pull up my banking app on my phone, the boutique manager stepped out from the back office. She was a poised woman who had assisted me many times, but today her perfectly manicured exterior was completely shattered. She looked nervous, glancing around the store before stepping close to me. "Ma'am," she said, her voice dropping to a tight whisper, "please come with me to the security office. It is urgent." Confusion washed over me. I followed her past the displays of silk ties and leather briefcases, my high heels clicking against the marble floor. We entered a small, dimly lit room lined with monitors showing every angle of the street outside. The manager pointed a shaking finger at the center screen. "I thought you should see this," she said, softly pointing ahead. I zoomed in tightly on the camera facing the street across from our main entrance. I looked at the grainy footage. There was Julian. He had not walked toward the parking garage where my Porsche was parked. Instead, he had crossed the avenue and approached a sleek white Mercedes waiting by the curb. My breath caught in my throat as the driver's side door opened. A young woman stepped out. She was beautiful, with long hair and a bright smile. Julian wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her in for a deep, passionate kiss that lasted entirely too long to be a friendly greeting. But the kiss was not the thing that made the blood freeze in my veins. It was what happened next. Julian reached into his coat and handed the woman 2 familiar shopping bags. They were the exact designer bags I had purchased yesterday afternoon. I had spent $15,000 on luxury purses, believing Julian when he said he wanted to surprise his mother Shirley and his sister Tara for their upcoming birthdays. He had asked me to use my card, claiming his business accounts were temporarily tied up in a major investment. I watched the woman squeal with delight, kissing him again before tossing my hard-earned purchases into the back seat of her car. Julian patted her waist, closed her door, and watched her drive away. I stood in the security room staring at the blank screen long after the car had disappeared. The manager handed me a glass of water, her eyes full of pity. I did not take it. I did not cry. I did not scream. A strange clinical numbness washed over my entire body. I thanked the manager politely, retrieved my declined card from the cashier, and walked out the back exit of the boutique. I stood in the cold drizzle, opening my rideshare app. Julian had driven away in the Porsche that I paid the monthly note on, leaving me stranded on the curb. I ordered an Uber, selecting the premium option purely out of habit, and waited under the awning of a coffee shop. When the black sedan finally arrived, I slid into the cold back seat, gave the quiet driver my address, and stared out the window at the passing city. The 30-minute ride home felt like a lifetime. In the quiet confines of the car, my mind transformed into a meticulous processing machine. The tears refused to fall. Instead, a cold, analytical fury took root in my chest. I began mentally reviewing the past 4 years of our marriage, playing back every moment like a detective examining a crime scene. I thought about Julian's frequent weekend business trips to neighboring states, the ones where he claimed he was securing venture capital for his startup. I thought about the late-night meetings that stretched until 2 in the morning. I thought about how protective he was of his phone, always placing it face down on the kitchen counter, taking it with him, even when he stepped into the shower. The puzzle pieces slammed together with sickening clarity. I had been funding a phantom life. I had exhausted myself working 70-hour weeks to build my agency, negotiating contracts, managing teams, and fighting for every ounce of success I had achieved. And Julian had been skimming the cream off the top of my empire to finance his double life. The designer bags were just the physical manifestation of a much deeper theft. I pulled out my phone and logged into my primary banking portal. The screen loaded, revealing the true extent of the damage. My checking account was drained. My corporate reserve lines were maxed out. I navigated to my property portal, my fingers flying across the screen. My heart stopped. A massive, unapproved secondary loan had been pulled against the equity of my home. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. This was not just a simple case of infidelity. This was a calculated, systematic financial execution. Julian was not cheating on me. He was actively trying to bankrupt me. I stared at the back of the driver's headrest, my breathing slow and measured. A lesser woman would have marched into that house, thrown his clothes onto the lawn, and screamed until her voice gave out. But I was not a lesser woman. I was a chief executive officer who solved complex problems for a living. Julian had made a fatal miscalculation. He assumed that because I loved him, I was blind. He assumed that because I was generous, I was weak. As the Uber pulled through the wrought iron gates of my neighborhood, I made a silent vow. I was not going to shed a tear over a man who viewed me as a bank account. I was going to dismantle his life with the exact ruthless precision he used to dismantle my trust. The car stopped in the driveway of my estate. I thanked the driver, stepped into the crisp air, and looked at the house I bought with my own sweat. The warm, inviting lights were on in the living room. Julian was inside, probably rehearsing whatever lie he was going to tell me. I smoothed the wrinkles from my skirt, adjusted my handbag, and walked toward the front door. The illusion of my marriage was dead, but the war was just beginning. I pushed open the heavy oak front door and stepped into the foyer. The house was immaculate. I had paid a premium for the interior designer, ensuring every velvet cushion and marble countertop reflected success. Now it just felt like a very expensive stage set. I slipped off my heels and placed my handbag on the console table. From the living room, a low groan echoed against the high ceilings. I walked slowly under the arched doorway and found Julian sprawled across the massive sectional sofa. He was clutching his abdomen, a half-empty glass of water resting on the coffee table beside him. A cold, wet washcloth was draped dramatically over his forehead. If I had not just watched him kissing his mistress outside a luxury boutique 20 minutes ago, I might have actually felt a surge of panic. He lifted the cloth, slightly squinting at me with a perfectly crafted expression of pain. "Maya." He breathed out, his voice raspy and weak. "I am so glad you are home." I stood at the edge of the plush rug, keeping my face entirely blank. "What happened to pulling the car around?" I asked, keeping my tone carefully measured. He let out another exaggerated groan and shifted his weight on the cushions. "My stomach," he whimpered. "It hit me right after I walked out of the store, a horrible stabbing pain. I thought my appendix was bursting. I had to flag down a cab and rush straight to the urgent care clinic down the street. The doctor said it is a severe bleeding ulcer, stress-induced." He reached a hand out toward me, expecting me to rush to his side to coddle him, to be the devoted wife I had always been. I did not move a single muscle. I just stared at his outstretched hand. "You went to the clinic," I repeated flatly, "without calling me." "My phone died," he said quickly, pulling his hand back and pressing it to his stomach again. I swear, Maya, the pain was blinding. I barely made it inside the clinic before I collapsed. Before I could press him on the logistical impossibility of his timeline, the sound of footsteps clicked against the hardwood floor. From the kitchen, Julian's mother Shirley and his sister Tara marched into the living room. Shirley carried a tray with a bowl of soup while Tara held a stack of throw blankets. They had let themselves in with the spare key I foolishly provided them last year. "There is my poor baby," Shirley cooed, setting the tray down and rushing to stroke Julian's hair. She turned her sharp gaze toward me, her eyes narrowing. "It took you long enough to get back here, Maya. Your husband has been in agony. The clinic called us from his emergency contact list while you were probably still browsing for shoes." Tara tossed the blankets onto the armchair, crossing her arms over her designer blouse. As a real estate agent, she always dressed to impress, usually funded by the generous holiday checks I wrote for her. "Seriously, Maya," Tara chimed in, her voice dripping with judgment. "He was texting you all morning about his stomach. You never listened to him." I looked at the three of them. A perfectly synchronized trio of deception. They had rehearsed this. Shirley and Tara were providing his alibi, acting as his shield. "I was not browsing," I said, keeping my voice terrifyingly calm. "I was at the register paying for your anniversary gift. But the transaction did not go through. My black card declined. The bank locked it down." Julian shifted uncomfortably on the couch, breaking eye contact. "Oh, right," he mumbled. "I meant to tell you about that. The fraud department flagged a purchase I made earlier for my startup. It must have frozen the joint accounts. I will call them tomorrow to sort it out." "Do not stress him out with money talk right now," Shirley snapped, practically hovering over him. "He has an ulcer, Maya. The doctor said he needs absolute peace and quiet." "I see," I replied, folding my arms. "Did the doctor also prescribe locking lips with a woman in a white Mercedes across from the boutique? Because the security cameras caught that treatment plan very clearly. And it looked quite vigorous." The room plunged into an absolute suffocating silence. Julian's face drained of color. The fake pain vanished, replaced by sheer panic. He sat up straight, the wet washcloth sliding off his head and landing with a wet smack on the expensive rug. "Maya, I can explain," Julian stammered, his eyes darting frantically between his mother and his sister. "It is not what it looked like. She is an investor." "An investor," I repeated, tasting the sheer absurdity of the lie. "And you gave this investor the $15,000 worth of designer bags I bought yesterday. The bags you claimed were birthday gifts for your mother and sister." Shirley stepped right up to me, invading my personal space, her face contorted into a mask of pure indignation. "Listen to me very carefully," she demanded, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. "My son is a hard-working black man trying to build an empire. He has to network. He has to charm people. Sometimes business looks bad from the outside, but you have no right to come in here throwing wild accusations while he is practically bleeding internally." I stared at her, genuinely astounded. "He is lying, Shirley. There is no ulcer. I saw him. What you saw was your own paranoia." Shirley countered, her volume rising. She was deploying her favorite tactic. Whenever Julian was caught in a lie, Shirley turned it into a systemic issue, a cultural failing on my part. "This is exactly your problem, Maya. You make a little bit of money, and suddenly you think you are better than everyone. You think you own him." You are pulling the angry black woman card over a simple business meeting. It is toxic. No wonder his stomach is in knots. You are making your own husband sick with your constant suspicion and hostility. I felt a cold rage burning behind my ribs. The sheer audacity to weaponize my race, my gender, and my hard-earned success against me to protect her cheating son was staggering. Tara stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with her mother. "Mom is right," Tara said, her voice laced with mock pity. "You are completely out of control, Maya. You track his every move. You monitor his spending. It is financial abuse. You use your wealth to control him because you are deeply insecure." Julian told us how suffocating it has been for him lately. He is trying to build a future for both of you, and you are hunting down security footage like a crazy person. You need to get professional help. I looked at Julian. He was sitting quietly on the couch, letting his mother and sister tear my character to shreds. He looked like a frightened child hiding behind his mother's skirt. He was perfectly content to let them paint me as an abusive, paranoid monster if it meant saving his own skin. They were all in on it. They were a unified front of parasites feeding off my resources while despising me for having them. If I argued back, if I screamed, I would simply validate their narrative. I would become the hysterical, angry woman they desperately wanted me to be. They wanted a fight so they could turn the tables and play the victim. I realized in that split second that logic and truth held absolutely no power in this room. They did not care about the truth. They only cared about protecting their meal ticket. I needed time. I needed access to my accounts, my legal documents, and my property records. If I tipped my hand now, Julian would scramble to cover his tracks and hide the money he had stolen. I had to let them think they had won. I had to make them feel secure. I let my shoulders drop intentionally, loosening my defensive posture. I took a slow, deep breath and forced the tension out of my face. I looked at Shirley, then at Tara, and finally at Julian. I summoned every ounce of willpower I possessed and forced a soft, apologetic smile onto my lips. "You are right," I said, letting my voice waver just enough to sound defeated. "I must be stressed. I have been working entirely too much lately. I am so sorry, Julian." Shirley crossed her arms, looking down at me with a triumphant smirk. "See, that is all we ask of you, Maya. A little basic understanding." Tara nodded, adjusting her silk shirt as if she had just won a major legal battle. Julian visibly relaxed, letting out a loud exhale as he sank back into the soft pillows of our couch. The silent war had officially begun. The next morning, I brewed coffee and brought a cup to the bedroom. Julian stirred, groaning softly, still playing the ailing husband. I smiled a crafted mask of wifely concern and kissed his forehead. I told him to rest, claiming that I was heading to the office early for a major client crisis. He kissed my hand, thanking me. I walked out, my smile dropping instantly. I did not go to my agency. Instead, I drove straight to the financial district. My destination was a private wealth management firm that catered exclusively to high-net-worth individuals. I bypassed reception and headed straight for the corner office. Marcus, my senior wealth manager, was waiting for me. I had emailed him at 2 a.m, flagging my accounts for suspicious activity and demanding an emergency audit. Marcus was a sharp, meticulous man. He did not offer his usual warm greeting. His face was grim. He gestured to the chair opposite his oak desk. The thick stack of printed statements sitting between us felt like a bomb waiting to detonate. I sat down quietly, crossing my legs and folding my hands tightly in my lap. I did not want small talk. I told Marcus to pull up every single transaction, transfer, and withdrawal Julian had initiated over the past 12 months. Marcus adjusted his glasses and opened the first file. He explained my primary checking and savings accounts had been systematically drained through escalating wire transfers. Julian had utilized his status as an authorized user to move funds into a separate corporate account registered under his startup. The amount started small, 5,000 here, 10,000 there. They were listed as operational expenses, software licensing, and vendor deposits. but over the last 6 months, the frequency and volume had multiplied exponentially. Marcus slid a spreadsheet across the desk. I traced my index finger slowly down the printed columns. 30,000, 50,000, 75,000. All funneled directly into Julian's LLC. I asked Marcus why this had not triggered a fraud alert sooner. Marcus looked at me with deep sympathy. He explained that because I had personally authorized the initial seed funding for Julian's business last year, the banking algorithms recognized his account as a trusted vendor. Julian had perfectly paced the withdrawals to stay just beneath the threshold of manual review until yesterday. Yesterday, Julian had attempted to wire $150,000 in a single transaction. That was the trigger that finally froze the accounts and declined my black card at the boutique. I sat in silence processing the numbers. Nearly $600,000 in liquid cash was simply gone, evaporated into the void of Julian's fake company. I felt a cold tightness in my jaw. I had spent years working through holidays, sacrificing sleep, and building a legacy, only to have it siphoned off by the man sleeping in my bed. But the financial bleeding did not stop at the liquid cash. Marcus cleared his throat, shifting uneasily in his chair. He reached for a separate, thicker folder. He told me that the cash transfers were only part of the problem. He asked me when I had authorized the new debt structure. I frowned, completely confused. I told him I carried zero debt outside of standard operational credit lines. I had paid off the primary mortgage on my estate 2 years ago. The house was entirely mine, free and clear. Marcus shook his head slowly. He opened the folder and turned it toward me. The top document was a legally binding loan agreement. My eyes scanned the bold print at the top of the page. It was a secondary mortgage pulled against the equity of my home. The principal amount was $450,000. The breath was knocked out of my lungs. I stared at the terrifying number, feeling a sudden, violent wave of nausea. $450,000 of debt anchored directly to my sanctuary, my home. If this loan defaulted, the bank could foreclose on my estate. Julian had not just stolen my cash. He had actively mortgaged my security, leveraging the roof over my head to fund his deceit. I looked up at Marcus, my voice dropping to a harsh, icy register. I demanded to know how this was legally possible. The house was in my name, exclusively. I had purchased it before we were married, and Julian was not on the deed. He could not leverage an asset he did not own. Marcus agreed, stating that the bank would never approve an equity loan without the primary owner's explicit notarized signature. He flipped to the final page of the loan agreement, pointing to the bottom right corner. He told me to look closely at the authorization section. I pulled the document closer. There, resting on the signature line, was my name. But it was not my handwriting. The strokes were rigid, an obvious, poorly executed forgery. Beside it was Julian's signature, signed boldly as my authorized representative. I traced the ink with my fingernail, the puzzle pieces clicking together into a horrifying picture. I asked Marcus what legal mechanism Julian used to force this through. Marcus flipped to the next page, revealing an attached addendum. It was a medical power of attorney. The date on the document was from exactly 14 months ago. The memory hit me with sharp clarity. 14 months ago, I was rushed to the hospital with a ruptured appendix. It was a chaotic, terrifying night. As they wheeled me toward the emergency operating room, a hospital administrator had shoved a clipboard into my hands. They told me I needed to sign a temporary medical directive appointing a proxy to make surgical decisions in case of severe complications. Drugged on pain medication and burning with a fever, I had hastily scrawled my signature, trusting Julian to handle the paperwork. I stared at the copy of the document in front of me. Julian had taken that emergency medical directive and maliciously altered it. He had somehow expanded the scope of the document, converting a temporary healthcare proxy into a durable, sweeping financial power of attorney. He had used my agonizing medical emergency as an opportunity to grant himself total, unchecked access to my entire financial existence. But altering a legal document of that magnitude required an official notary to verify the changes and stamp it into law. Julian could not have done it alone. He desperately needed a willing co-conspirator. He needed someone with a state-issued notary license willing to commit a federal crime. I looked at the bottom of the altered power of attorney. There, stamped in crisp blue ink, was the official seal of the notary public. I read the name printed inside the circular stamp. Tara Washington, Julian's sister. The same sister who had stood in my living room last night wearing the clothes I paid for, aggressively defending her brother and calling me financially controlling. Tara had used her real estate notary license to validate a forged document. She had officially stamped a lie, granting her brother the legal authority to rob me blind. The sheer scale of the betrayal radiated through my veins, freezing every last drop of warmth I possessed. This was not a simple affair. This was a coordinated, premeditated financial execution, orchestrated by a family of absolute parasites. Julian, Tara, and Shirley had likely sat around a dinner table drinking wine bought with my money, laughing as they drafted this fraudulent scheme. They had looked at my success and decided they were entitled to it. They had looked at my love and decided to weaponize it. I sat back in the leather chair, letting the silence fill the room. Marcus watched me carefully, offering to call the fraud department, offering to immediately involve the authorities and have Julian arrested by the end of the day. He warned me that this crossed the line into felony fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny. I held up my hand, stopping him. I definitely did not want Julian arrested today. If he went to jail, now the money he stole would be tied up in endless criminal proceedings, and I would be left fighting the bank over a fraudulent mortgage. I absolutely needed to trap them. I needed to legally sever myself from this debt and attach it completely permanently to Julian's name before the police ever got involved. I looked at Marcus, my eyes devoid of any emotion. I told him to leave the accounts frozen, but to say nothing to Julian. I slowly gathered the copies of the fraudulent mortgage, the altered power of attorney, and the drained bank statements. I tucked them neatly into the compartments of my expensive leather briefcase. The foolish, trusting woman who had so blindly loved Julian died inside this very office. The woman walking out was a cold, calculating predator, and I was going to methodically tear their pathetic lives apart, brick by brick. The city skyline was a blur. As I drove back to my agency office, the weight of the forged mortgage papers, sitting on the passenger seat, like a live grenade. I did not go home. Home was a crime scene, now a place where I was being systematically dismantled by people I had once called family. Instead, I drove to the glass and steel tower of my agency, a sanctuary of my own making where logic and order still reigned. I locked myself in my private office, activated the secure line, and made 2 calls. The first was to Elias Thorne, a private investigator known for his discretion and his ability to make the most deeply buried secrets surface. The second was to Sarah Jenkins, a forensic accountant who had once helped me navigate a hostile corporate acquisition. I did not need to explain much. They knew my professional reputation. They knew I did not pay for their time unless I had a serious problem that needed an immediate lethal solution. Within 3 hours, the 3 of us were huddled around my conference table. The room was sterile, bathed in the cool light of the afternoon sun. I laid the forged documents out on the table. Elias, a man who looked like he had seen the worst of humanity and remained entirely unimpressed, examined the mortgage papers with a practiced eye. Sarah, her laptop already humming, began accessing the encrypted servers where she kept her forensic tools. I told them everything. I laid bare the timeline from the emergency appendectomy a year ago to the discovery of the secondary mortgage, the forged power of attorney, and the stolen bags. My goal was not just to prove the theft. I wanted a forensic autopsy of Julian's entire life. I needed to know every dollar he had siphoned from me and exactly where it had been buried. We started with the shell entity he called his tech startup. He had registered it as InnovateSphere, LLC. On paper, it was a software development firm specializing in cloud infrastructure. In reality, it was a hollowed-out husk. Sarah pulled up the Secretary of State records. She traced the filing history, the registered agent, and the operational address. It was all smoke and mirrors. The registered agent was a P.O. box in a strip mall 3 towns over. The operational address was a co-working space that had no record of InnovateSphere as a client. Julian had been incredibly brazen. He had used my own company's tax identification number to open business bank accounts for his Shell LLC. He had essentially been running a parasite operation, using my corporate credibility to borrow funds and conduct business that did not exist. Sarah delved deeper. She started pulling every bank statement for the LLC, correlating the deposits with the withdrawals. She broke down the transaction history, isolating the $450,000 from the fraudulent mortgage. "This is where it gets interesting," Sarah said, her voice devoid of emotion as she stared at her screen. She was moving with the speed of a master chess player, clicking through layers of financial activity. The money did not sit in the account. It was not used for software development. It was not used for office rent, and it was certainly not used for marketing. Julian had engaged in a textbook layering scheme. He moved the money within minutes of the mortgage lender depositing the funds. It went from the primary business account to a secondary holding account, then was split into 4 smaller amounts and moved to a series of offshore digital wallets that served as temporary parking spots. I watched, mesmerized by the sheer complexity of the theft. He had moved that money like a ghost through the financial system, breaking it down into smaller, less suspicious chunks to avoid triggering mandatory reporting requirements. He had layered it through 3 different states before it ever hit an account that was remotely related to a real asset. But Sarah was better than he was. She followed the trail of digital breadcrumbs, untangling the knots he had tied to keep his tracks covered. She traced the money for 4 hours, ignoring the coffee cooling on the table, her focus entirely on the digital path. Elias was working in tandem, running background checks on the recipients of the final wire transfers. He found that the accounts weren't just random holding entities. They were tied to a specific title company in a neighboring county. The final layer of the onion was peeled back when Sarah found the ultimate destination. The money was not being laundered into crypto or offshore accounts for long-term storage. It was being consolidated. The entire $450,000 had been reassembled in a single transaction. Sarah pointed to the final line item on her display. She highlighted the destination. The wire transfer had been executed for a purchase agreement at a closing office in the suburbs. The asset, a high-end luxury townhouse in a gated community, purchased in full in cash. I stared at the address on the screen. It was a gated development I had only heard about in passing, a place reserved for the city's new money. I pulled up the property records on my phone. The townhouse was currently listed as the registered address for a private trust. The beneficiary of the trust was not Julian. It was his sister, Tara. The pieces shifted once more. It was not just about funding his lifestyle. It was about securing an asset for his family, ensuring that even if I caught him and cut him off, he had a safe house, a physical asset, tucked away in his sister's name. They had used my stolen money to buy a fortress. I looked at Elias, then at Sarah. My face remained a mask of professional neutrality, but my internal state was pure white-hot fusion. I had the destination. I had the trail. I had the proof of the forgery and the financial fraud. I asked Sarah if she could produce a consolidated report of the movement of the $450,000, clearly mapping the path from my home equity to the title company that closed the townhouse. She nodded. She had it ready to export to a secure encrypted drive before the sun went down. Elias looked at me. He asked what I wanted him to do with this. He could have his people shadow the townhouse, get photos of whoever was moving in, and document the entire life of that trust. He could find out if Jasmine, the woman in the Mercedes, was also on the deed. I told him to do it. I wanted every detail. I wanted to know the interior design choices they were making with my money. I wanted to know when they took out the trash. I wanted them to feel safe in that house, so safe that they would let their guard down. I wanted them to build a life in that townhouse so that when I took it back, they would feel the full weight of the loss. As Elias and Sarah prepared to leave, I felt a terrifying sense of clarity. The scope of their betrayal was far wider than I had initially calculated. They had not just stolen cash, they had exploited a traumatic medical emergency, orchestrated a felony forgery, and actively laundered the proceeds to buy real estate, all while looking me in the eye at dinner. They were not just parasites, they were a criminal syndicate operating under the guise of family. I sat alone in my office as the evening deepened into night. I thought about the $450,000 sitting in that townhouse. I thought about the forged mortgage that currently sat in my briefcase. Julian and Tara thought they were smart. They thought that by hiding behind legal instruments, notarized seals, and complex banking layers, they were untouchable. They had underestimated the fact that I was a woman who could not only trace a fraudulent dollar, but also construct a legal labyrinth that would ensure they ended up in a prison cell of their own making. I opened the encrypted file Sarah had left on my drive. I began to build my own strategy. I would not just take back the house. I would take everything. I would hold them accountable for every single cent they had siphoned, every fraudulent document they had signed, and every moment they had mocked me while living on my money. I would play the part of the stressed, overworking, oblivious wife for a few more days. I would make Julian feel confident in his stolen wealth. I would make Tara believe her forgery was the perfect crime. I closed my laptop and looked out the window at the city I had conquered. They had stolen my money, and they had stolen my peace, but they had fundamentally failed to steal my power. Julian had looked at me and seen a target. He had failed to realize he was looking at the woman who would be the architect of his total absolute ruin. The forensic report was sitting on my desk, a collection of pages that would act as the death warrant for their comfortable life. I leaned back in my chair, watching the city lights blink to life, feeling a dark, cold satisfaction. The paper trail had finally reached its end, and their escape route was officially closed. I would let them sleep one last night in their stolen townhouse. Tomorrow, the protocol for their destruction would be initiated, and there would be no going back for any of them. The game was mine, the board was set, and I was about to checkmate. The game was mine, the board was set, and I was about to checkmate. I did not go back to my empty mansion that night. I slept on the leather sofa in my private office, my mind calculating every variable until the morning sun broke over the city skyline. At 7 in the morning, I washed my face in the executive washroom, smoothed my tailored blazer, and took the elevator down to the private garage. I bypassed my usual sleek sedan and slid into the rented black SUV I had secured specifically for this morning. I needed to be invisible. I needed to see the devastation with my own two eyes. I drove toward the address Sarah and Elias had pulled from the wire transfers. The drive took me 45 minutes out of the city core and into a sprawling, aggressively manicured suburb where the streets were lined with ancient oak trees and expensive wrought iron gates. The entrance to the townhouse community required a resident code, but Elias had already bypassed that hurdle, providing me with a contractor access pin that opened the heavy metal gates without a second delay. I rolled through the entrance and navigated the winding, pristine streets. The houses here were massive, featuring stone facades, three-car garages, and flawlessly landscaped front yards. I found the address: a stunning, modern tri-level townhouse with custom floor-to-ceiling windows and a wide slate driveway. I parked the rented SUV half a block down the street, killing the engine and slipping into the shadows of the tinted windows. I sat there in the heavy silence, gripping the leather steering wheel. The air inside the car felt thick, almost suffocating. I stared at the heavy mahogany front door of the townhouse, waiting for the ghosts of my marriage to step out into the daylight. As I watched that silent door, a profound, exhausting sorrow washed over me. It was not grief for the loss of my husband. It was a deep mourning for my own wasted energy. I sat in the cold car and thought about the invisible weight I had carried my entire adult life. In our community, they call it the black tax. It is the unspoken expectation that when you achieve significant success, you must reach back and pull everyone else up with you, regardless of the personal cost. You carry the financial and emotional burdens of your family, your extended relatives, and your partner. I had bought into that lie completely. I had exhausted myself bleeding my own spirit dry to uplift a man who I believed just needed a solid foundation to thrive. When I met Julian, he had big dreams and empty pockets. I was already running a successful design agency, and I made it my personal mission to elevate him. I paid off his crushing student loans. I bought him tailored suits so he could sit in corporate boardrooms and feel like he belonged. I funded his fake startup because I wanted a black man to succeed in a space that constantly locked us out. But my success did not inspire him. It emasculated him. He resented me for every dollar I earned, for every magazine cover I landed, and for every room I commanded. He could not handle being the lesser half of a powerful woman, so he decided to shrink me by draining my accounts and building a parallel world where he could play the wealthy provider. He used the empire I built with my blood, sweat, and sleepless nights to finance a fantasy where he was the absolute king. He resented my power, yet he was perfectly happy to steal the fruits of my labor to fund his fragile ego. I had poured my soul into uplifting a man who viewed my success as an insult and my generosity as a weakness to be exploited. The bitter irony burned in my throat. I had paid the ultimate black tax, subsidizing my own destruction to stroke the ego of a deeply insecure man who could never match my drive. The heavy mahogany door finally swung open. My breath hitched, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Julian stepped out onto the pristine slate porch. He was wearing casual weekend clothes, a cashmere sweater I had bought him for Christmas, and expensive leather loafers. He looked relaxed, radiant, and entirely unbothered by the supposed bleeding ulcer that had left him incapacitated on my living room couch just 48 hours ago. Then Jasmine walked out behind him. She was wearing a matching athletic set, her hair pulled back into a casual ponytail. She handed Julian a travel coffee mug, smiling up at him with the easy, comfortable familiarity of a woman who had spent years building a life with a man. But the killing blow, the sight that physically ripped the breath from my lungs, came a second later. A little boy no older than 2 toddled out of the front door. He was holding a small toy car, his bright laughter echoing across the quiet suburban street. Julian turned, his face lighting up with genuine, unbridled joy. He scooped the toddler up into his arms, tossing him gently into the air before settling the boy securely on his hip. Jasmine wrapped her arm around Julian's waist, leaning her head affectionately against his shoulder as they walked down the driveway toward the white Mercedes I had seen on the security footage. They looked like the perfect, wealthy suburban family. A devoted father, a loving mother, and a happy son living their best lives in a $500,000 home that my agency had secretly paid for. I stared at the toddler resting happily on Julian's hip, and the final, most monstrous piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The boy was 2 years old. That meant Julian had gotten Jasmine pregnant 3 years ago, right around the time we were celebrating our first wedding anniversary. But it was not just Julian's infidelity that made my blood run completely cold. It was the horrifying realization of Shirley's absolute complicity. My mother-in-law had known. She had known about this child for years. The memory of her voice hit me like a physical assault. Over the past 3 years, I had suffered through 2 agonizing, heartbreaking miscarriages. They were the darkest moments of my life, days spent lying in sterile hospital beds crying until my eyes swelled shut, mourning the children I could not carry to term. And through it all, Shirley had been a relentless, cruel tormentor. She had stood in my kitchen sipping imported tea paid for by my agency and quietly shamed me. She had called me barren. She had told me that my body was broken because I cared more about my career than being a proper mother to her son's children. She had weaponized my deepest trauma, looking me directly in the eyes and telling me I was failing her son by denying him a legacy. I sat in the SUV, trembling as the sheer magnitude of her evil washed over me. Shirley had tortured me over my dead children while secretly bouncing her hidden grandson on her knee across town. She had allowed me to drown in grief, self-loathing, and feelings of utter inadequacy. all while she attended secret birthday parties for the child her son had fathered with a mistress. She had accepted my expensive gifts, let me pay off her car, and allowed me to fund her luxurious lifestyle, knowing the entire time that my money was also putting a roof over her secret grandchild. The cruelty was so absolute, so profoundly demonic, that it transcended mere betrayal. They had not just stolen my money, they had systematically tortured my soul. I watched Julian strap the little boy into a car seat in the back of the white Mercedes. I watched Jasmine slide into the passenger seat. I watched my husband climb behind the steering wheel and drive away, leaving the beautiful stolen house behind in the clear morning sun. I did not cry. The tears that had threatened to fall earlier completely evaporated. The agonizing sorrow, the residual love, the pain of the miscarriages and the heavy burden of the black tax, all of it burned away in the span of a single heartbeat. My heart, once full of generous, unconditional love, turned into a block of pure, impenetrable ice. I reached down and turned the key in the ignition. The heavy engine of the rented SUV roared to loud life. I pulled out of the dark shadows, carefully merging onto the pristine suburban street, and drove back toward the city. I was no longer a naive victim weeping over a broken marriage. The woman who had blindly funded their entire existence was dead and buried on this quiet street. I was a relentless, unstoppable force of nature, and I was going to entirely obliterate them. By the time Sunday afternoon rolled around, my sprawling estate smelled of roasted rosemary, garlic, and slow-cooked lamb. I had spent the morning preparing a feast fit for royalty, moving through my immaculate kitchen with mechanical precision. I arranged the fine china on the long mahogany dining table, aligning the heavy crystal water glasses and polishing the silver forks until I could see my own reflection in them. Every detail had to be perfect. The stage needed to be set for their ultimate comfort. I wanted them to feel entirely secure, wrapped in the luxurious lifestyle they believed they had successfully stolen from me. Julian walked into the kitchen wearing a tailored casual suit I had purchased for him 3 months ago. He wrapped his arms around my waist from behind, pressing a soft kiss to my neck. He thanked me for putting in the effort, murmuring about how exhausted his ulcer had made him and how much he needed a quiet family evening. I leaned back into his embrace, forcing a gentle smile onto my face, suppressing the violent urge to grab the carving knife resting on the marble counter. I told him he deserved a wonderful meal after working so hard on his startup. He beamed, kissing my cheek before walking into the living room to pour himself a glass of my most expensive scotch. At exactly 5 o'clock, the front door chimed. Shirley and Tara let themselves in, their voices echoing loudly through the grand foyer. They walked into the dining room dripping in designer labels. Tara was carrying a new leather handbag that I instantly recognized. It was the exact shade of emerald green I had seen in a boutique window last week, retailing for just under $4,000. It was funded undoubtedly by the offshore accounts my money had been funneled through. Shirley wore a silk blouse and a thick gold necklace, her chin held high with that familiar, unwarranted arrogance. We took our seats around the massive table. Julian sat at the head, claiming the position of the patriarch, while I sat at the opposite end. Shirley and Tara sat across from each other. The air in the room was immediately suffocating thick with the weight of their collective deception. Shirley insisted on leading the prayer before we began eating. She reached out, demanding we all join hands. I extended my hand, letting Julian take my left and Tara take my right. Her skin was warm, her manicured nails digging slightly into my palm. Shirley bowed her head and closed her eyes. Her voice rose in a dramatic, sweeping cadence. She thanked God for the bountiful food. She thanked God for the beautiful home. But most importantly, she raised her volume to thank God for her incredible son. She prayed for Julian's continued business success. She thanked the Lord for blessing his startup, for giving him the strength to overcome his health struggles, and for making him a shining example of Black excellence. She actually asked God to multiply the fruits of his labor, praising his late nights, his dedication, and his unwavering integrity. I kept my head bowed, my eyes wide open, staring at the polished mahogany table. My blood roared in my ears. She was invoking the name of God to celebrate a criminal enterprise funded by my stolen wealth. She was blessing a man who spent his late nights sleeping in a secret townhouse with a mistress and a toddler. The sheer blinding hypocrisy of her prayer was almost a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I squeezed Tara's hand a fraction tighter, channeling my rage into a silent promise of destruction. Shirley finished with a resounding amen, and the table echoed her words. I smiled, releasing their hands, and smoothly transitioned into the role of the devoted hostess. I passed the serving dishes, offering generous portions of lamb and roasted potatoes. The room filled with the sounds of heavy silver forks scraping against fine china, the clinking of crystal glasses, and the wet, obnoxious sounds of chewing. Shirley took a bite of the lamb and immediately sighed, dabbing the corners of her mouth with a linen napkin. She offered a passive-aggressive compliment, noting that it was a miracle I had found the time to cook such a large meal, considering how obsessed I was with my agency. She added that it was good to see me finally acting like a proper wife instead of a corporate machine. Tara chimed in, chewing a piece of bread as she agreed with her mother. She pointed her fork at me, stating that Julian had been carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, while I was busy running around the financial district. She said a man needed a peaceful home, not a wife who interrogated him about credit card declines while he was suffering from a bleeding ulcer. Julian looked down at his plate, playing the part of the weary noble victim. He quietly asked them to stop claiming he did not want to argue during Sunday dinner. It was a masterful performance. They were validating his victimhood, painting me as the villain, and reinforcing their absolute right to my resources. I kept my expressions soft, apologetic, and completely submissive. I told them they were right. I admitted I had been stressed about work and that I had unfairly taken it out on Julian. I promised to do better, to be more supportive of his entrepreneurial journey. That was the exact opening Tara was waiting for. She set her fork down and leaned forward, resting her elbows on the mahogany table. She locked her eyes on mine, her expression shifting from passive-aggressive judgment to sharp, calculating business mode. She boldly pivoted the conversation, announcing that Julian's company was actually on the verge of a massive expansion. She claimed that InnovateSphere was about to secure a lucrative government contract, but they needed an immediate injection of capital to scale up their server capacity and hire dedicated support staff. Julian looked up, feigning surprise. He told Tara they had agreed not to talk about business at the dinner table. He looked at me with wide, innocent eyes, claiming he did not want to burden me with his corporate stress. He said he was going to approach an outside angel investor on Tuesday. Shirley slammed her hand flat against the table, rattling the crystal glasses. She looked at me with fierce, manufactured indignation. She demanded to know why her son should have to beg strangers for money when his own wife was sitting on a massive fortune. She launched into a heavy, suffocating guilt trip. She told me that this was the fundamental problem with successful Black women. She said the moment we achieve a fraction of wealth, we hoard it. We refuse to uplift Black men. She claimed I was stunting my own husband's growth because I was secretly terrified he would become more successful than me. She said family supports family, and that my money meant nothing if I was not using it to build a generational empire with my husband. Tara nodded vigorously, pulling a pristine manila folder from her $4,000 handbag. She slid it across the table toward me. She said it was an investment prospectus. She told me Julian needed exactly $100,000 to secure the government contract. She claimed it was a bridge loan, a temporary cash injection that he would pay back with 20% interest within 6 months. She looked at me with challenging, predatory eyes, daring me to refuse. She told me that if I truly believed in my husband, if I truly wanted to be a supportive partner, writing a check for $100,000 should be effortless. I looked down at the folder. I knew exactly what it was. It was a request for the final installment needed to furnish the secret townhouse. It was the money they needed to buy Jasmine a new car, or fund a luxury vacation for their hidden family. They were sitting in my house eating my food using my racial identity and my marriage vows to extort another $100,000 out of my accounts. They were so emboldened by their previous success that they were openly demanding I finance my own replacement. I slowly reached out and pulled the folder toward me. I did not open it. I kept my hands resting lightly on the thick paper. I looked at Shirley's demanding glare, Tara's arrogant smirk, and Julian's carefully crafted mask of humble desperation. I let the silence stretch, playing the part of a woman torn between her financial caution and her wily devotion. I needed them to believe they were breaking my resolve. I needed them to feel the thrill of the hunt, the intoxicating rush of manipulating their target into total submission. I let out a long, heavy sigh, dropping my shoulders in a display of defeat. I looked at Julian, softening my eyes, making sure to project an overwhelming amount of guilt and love. I told him I was so sorry for doubting him earlier this week. I said I knew how hard he was working and that I wanted to be the partner he truly deserved. I told him I did not want him going to outside investors. I wanted to keep the success in the family. Julian's eyes widened. A flash of pure, greedy triumph crossed his face before he quickly suppressed it. He reached across the table and grabbed my hand, squeezing it tightly. He told me I had no idea how much this meant to him. He promised I would not regret it. He swore this was the final push he needed to make his company a global success. Shirley leaned back in her chair, a smug, victorious smile spreading across her face. She picked up her wine glass, looking at me with total condescension. She told me I was finally making a smart decision. She said this was what real love looked like. Tara quickly pulled a pen from her bag and offered it to me eagerly, suggesting we could transfer the funds first thing tomorrow morning. I took the pen from Tara, rolling it slowly between my fingers. I told them I needed to speak with my wealth manager tomorrow to liquidate some assets, but that I would personally authorize the wire transfer by Wednesday afternoon. I promised them the $100,000 would be in the Innovate Sphere account before the end of the week. The atmosphere in the room instantly transformed. The suffocating tension evaporated, replaced by a jubilant, celebratory energy. Shirley raised her glass for a toast, praising my generosity. Tara clinked her glass against Julian's, laughing loudly. Julian kissed my hand again, looking at me with fake adoration. They were celebrating a heist. They were popping champagne over my absolute stupidity. I smiled warmly, raising my own glass of water to join their toast. I watched them revel in their victory. I let them drink my expensive wine and enjoy my perfectly cooked lamb. I wanted them to be as happy and secure as humanly possible. I needed them completely intoxicated by their own greed. Because on Wednesday afternoon, I was not going to wire them $100,000. On Wednesday afternoon, I was going to detonate the entire foundation of their existence, and I wanted them to be smiling right up until the exact moment the shockwave hit. The rest of the dinner progressed with a sickeningly festive atmosphere. Julian practically inhaled the remainder of his roasted lamb, his fake bleeding ulcer miraculously cured by the promise of a six-figure wire transfer. Shirley demanded I pour her another glass of my vintage reserve Pinot Noir, her entire posture radiating the smug satisfaction of a conqueror who had just sacked a very wealthy, very gullible city. I poured the expensive dark red wine, watching the liquid swirl against the fine crystal, actively suppressing the image of blood in the water. I offered them all a bright, placid smile, perfectly acting the part of the chastened, devoted wife who had finally seen the light and surrendered her resources. I turned my attention to the opposite side of the long mahogany table. Tara was aggressively buttering a dinner roll, her eyes darting around my dining room as if she were taking mental inventory of everything she planned to steal next. I decided to deliberately feed her ego. I knew from years of dealing with aggressive corporate sharks that vanity was the absolute quickest way to make a predator careless. I rested my chin on my folded hands, projecting an aura of genuine fascination, and asked Tara how the real estate market was treating her these days. Tara swallowed loudly, her chest puffing out beneath her designer silk blouse. She immediately launched into a breathless, arrogant monologue about her recent triumphs in the local housing market. She bragged extensively about closing 3 massive deals in the last quarter, complaining loudly about how exhausted she was from carrying her entire brokerage firm on her back. She spoke with the unearned, brazen confidence of a woman standing on a mountain of stolen cash. She told me the luxury market was booming, especially out in the gated suburbs, and that she had recently helped a very exclusive, very private client secure a gorgeous property purchased entirely in cash. I kept my facial expression entirely neutral, though a cold electric thrill spiked heavily down my spine. She was talking about her own hidden fortress. She was sitting at my dining table eating the food I cooked and openly bragging about the luxury townhouse she had purchased, using my forged mortgage funds. The sheer breathtaking arrogance of her display was a dark marvel to witness. I nodded slowly, adopting a look of profound, respectful admiration. I told her that her career sounded incredibly demanding and highly stressful. I said I had always respected the real estate profession deeply because of the immense legal liability involved in every single transaction. I kept my voice casual, light, and entirely conversational. I smoothly steered the topic toward the paperwork aspect of her job, mentioning how stressful it must be to personally handle the transfer of such massive, life-changing assets. I asked her how she managed the constant crushing anxiety of document security, pointing out that one wrong signature, one misplaced notary stamp, or one tiny administrative error could ruin a lucrative career instantly. Tara waved her manicured hand dismissively, nearly knocking over her crystal water glass in her haste to brush off my comment. She laughed, a sharp grating sound that echoed loudly off my high ceilings. She claimed that the legal side of real estate was just administrative busywork meant to scare easily intimidated people. She bragged that holding a notary license was the absolute easiest money she had ever made in her entire life. She said people were always so desperate to close their housing deals that they barely even read the dense contracts they were signing. She leaned forward, resting her elbows heavily on the table, lowering her voice conspiratorially. She told me that the entire banking system was incredibly easy to manipulate if you simply knew the right people at the title companies and understood how to bypass the slow, bureaucratic red tape. She actually winked at me. She playfully winked at the very woman she had just criminally defrauded. I maintained my warm, engaging smile, holding her gaze with a steady, unblinking intensity. I told her she must be an incredibly brave woman to navigate those waters. I said that federal prosecutors took real estate fraud very seriously these days, especially when it involved wire transfers across state lines. I kept my tone breezy, expertly wrapping a terrifying, lethal threat in the soft guise of a casual compliment. I casually remarked that I had recently read an investigative article about a prominent broker who went to a federal penitentiary for 20 years because she had falsified a durable power of attorney to secure a fraudulent mortgage loan. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my ice water, letting the heavy words hang in the silent air directly between us. I looked right into her dark eyes and said it was absolutely fascinating how a single drop of ink from a corrupted notary stamp could completely and permanently destroy a person's entire life. Tara did not even flinch. The lethal warning sailed completely over her greedy head, easily deflected by her absolute unshakable belief in her own intellectual superiority. She scoffed loudly, reaching for her wine glass and taking a massive gulp. She claimed that people who got caught by the authorities were simply stupid and lazy. She said they lacked true entrepreneurial vision and failed miserably to cover their digital tracks. She told me that the law was only a weapon used against people who did not know how to properly play the game. She smiled widely, revealing wine-stained teeth, and proudly stated that she was a master of the game. My internal monologue roared with dark, triumphant laughter. She was not a master of any game. She was a loud, foolish, pathetic amateur playing in a ruthless league she could not even begin to comprehend. While she sat there bragging about her untouchable genius and her fabricated real estate prowess, I was mentally finalizing the precise timeline of her absolute ruin. I mapped out my strategy meticulously, watching the second hand on the dining room clock tick forward. On Wednesday morning, the promised $100,000 wire transfer would absolutely not happen. Instead, my wealth manager Marcus would trigger a catastrophic system-wide lock on every single financial account associated with Julian, including the Hidden Shell LLC. The banking fraud division would officially receive the comprehensive forensic dossier my team had compiled over the weekend. By Wednesday afternoon, the highest levels of federal law enforcement would be looking at the pristine, undeniable proof of Tara's forged notary seal. I shifted my steady gaze to Shirley. My mother-in-law was happily cutting into a second large slice of cherry pie, entirely oblivious to the fact that her luxurious, subsidized lifestyle was currently counting down to zero. She had cruelly called me barren in my own home. She had mocked my deepest medical trauma and shamed my grief. On Wednesday morning, my private investigator Elias would deliver a thick, glossy envelope directly to Shirley's front door via secure courier. The package would contain dozens of high-resolution photographs of Julian Jasmine and the hidden toddler walking happily out of the luxury townhouse she thought they had kept entirely secret from me. I wanted Shirley to know clearly that I knew everything. I wanted her to realize that her ultimate, cruelest weapon against me had been completely neutralized and that she was about to be entirely and permanently cut off from my wealth. She would never see another dime of my money, and she would have to watch her precious son face a judge. Finally, I looked at Julian, my lying husband, the man I had once promised to love, honor, and protect. He was leaning far back in his chair, rubbing his stomach perfectly, playing the role of the satisfied, victorious king. He genuinely thought he had successfully manipulated his wealthy, foolish, overworked wife into blindly funding the final crucial stage of his elaborate escape plan. He had absolutely no idea that I had already hired the most vicious, relentless divorce attorney in the entire state. He had no idea that my forensic accountant had already tracked down his scattered offshore holding accounts and flagged them for immediate aggressive asset seizure. Julian thought he was walking away with millions of dollars in untraceable cash. He was actually going to walk away with a crushing mountain of unserviceable debt, a permanently destroyed professional reputation, and a looming federal indictment for grand larceny and identity theft. I smiled gently at my husband, feeling nothing inside my chest but a cold, clinical detachment. I asked him if his stomach was feeling any better after such a heavy meal. He offered me a weak, brave, sickeningly sweet smile, claiming the incredible news about my investment had worked absolute wonders for his chronic stress levels. He reached out and touched my arm, looking deeply into my eyes, and told me I was his guardian angel. I nodded slowly, agreeing that I was entirely devoted to his future. I promised him, looking directly into his lying eyes, that by the end of this very week, his entire life was going to change in ways he could not even begin to imagine. He thanked me profusely, completely and utterly blind to the execution order, hidden carefully beneath my sweet, supportive words. The exhausting dinner finally concluded. Shirley and Tara gathered their expensive cashmere coats and their stolen designer bags, kissing Julian affectionately on the cheek and offering me tight, fake smiles of approval. I walked them slowly to the front door, flawlessly playing the gracious, accommodating hostess until the very last possible second. I stood on the porch and watched them climb into Shirley's luxury SUV, waving pleasantly as they backed out of my long slate driveway. Julian stood closely beside me in the cool evening air, wrapping his arms securely around my shoulders. He leaned in and whispered that he was the luckiest man alive to have me. I leaned softly into his touch, resting my head against his shoulder, my mind furiously calculating the exact distance between his current state of blissful arrogance and his impending incarceration. The silent, agonizing war was officially over. The financial and legal trap was permanently set. I turned and closed the heavy oak front door, locking it securely against the dark night. The exhausting game of pretending was finally finished and the era of their absolute destruction was ready to begin. Monday morning arrived crisp and sharp. I bypassed my design agency entirely, sending a brief message to my executive assistant that I would be unreachable for the entire day. I drove into the heart of the financial district, pulling into the subterranean parking garage of a sleek, towering glass skyscraper. I took the private elevator up to the 42nd floor, stepping out into the hushed, intimidating reception area of Sterling and Vance. This was not a law firm for amicable separations or mediated settlements. This was a firm where the city's elite went to financially eviscerate their spouses. I was ushered immediately into a sprawling corner office overlooking the harbor. Valerie Vance sat behind a massive desk carved from a single slab of polished obsidian. She was a woman in her late 50s with silver hair cut into a severe geometric bob and eyes the color of winter ice. She did not offer me a warm smile or a platitude about how sorry she was for my marital troubles. She simply pointed a manicured finger toward a leather chair opposite her desk and demanded I empty my briefcase. I respected her instantly. I placed the thick, heavily tabbed dossier my forensic accountant and private investigator had compiled over the weekend directly onto her desk. Valerie opened it, sliding on a pair of gold-rimmed reading glasses. For 20 minutes, the only sound in the cavernous office was the crisp turning of heavy paper. I sat perfectly still, watching her sharp eyes scan the forged mortgage documents, the offshore LLC incorporation papers, and the glossy photographs of Julian bouncing a secret toddler on his hip outside a $500,000 townhouse. Valerie finally closed the dossier, pressing her palms flat against the obsidian surface. She looked at me with a mix of professional admiration and cold, calculating pity. She stated that Julian was a remarkably industrious parasite. She commended my ability to sit through Sunday dinner without plunging a steak knife into his chest, acknowledging that most of her clients would have been in police custody by now. I told her I did not want him dead. I wanted him destitute, publicly humiliated, and facing federal charges. I told her I wanted to file for divorce, immediately, freeze all our joint assets, and hand the entire file over to the district attorney. Valerie leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers. She told me that acting on impulse was the absolute fastest way to ruin a perfectly good execution. She picked up the forged mortgage document bearing Tara's fraudulent notary stamp. Valerie explained the brutal, infuriating reality of family law. If I filed for divorce today, the court would automatically freeze everything, but they would also view that $450,000 fraudulent loan as marital debt. She explained that Julian had cleverly used my agency's credentials and our joint credit history to secure the funds. Even though it was blatant fraud, untangling that mess in a divorce proceeding would take years of agonizing, fiercely expensive litigation. The banks would come after my business assets to recoup the stolen funds, while the courts slowly sorted out the criminal liability. Julian would drag me down into the mud with him, tying up my life's work in endless depositions and asset seizures. The injustice of it burned in my chest. I stared at Valerie, my voice tight with rage. I demanded to know how a man could steal my identity, purchase a secret house for his mistress, and leave me holding the bag just because we signed a marriage license. Valerie offered a thin, razor-sharp smile. She told me the law was rarely about justice. It was entirely about leverage. She said we needed to surgically extract me from the blast radius before we triggered the explosion. We could not file for divorce. Not yet. We needed Julian to willingly, eagerly take absolute legal ownership of his crimes without realizing he was doing it. I asked her how we could possibly convince a greedy, manipulative narcissist to voluntarily assume $500,000 in fraudulent debt. Valerie stood up, walking toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gray harbor. She said we were going to use his own weapon against him. We were going to leverage his fragile, oversized ego. She turned back to me, her ice-blue eyes gleaming with malicious intent. She proposed a post-nuptial agreement. I frowned, questioning how a post-nuptial agreement would solve the immediate threat of the mortgage fraud. Valerie returned to her desk, tapping the glossy photographs of Julian's secret family. She reminded me of the conversation I had described from Sunday dinner. She reminded me of Julian's fake startup, the supposed government contract, and the $100,000 cash injection he was expecting by Wednesday. She told me we were going to package the post-nuptial agreement as a high-level business asset protection plan. Valerie laid out the strategy with the cold precision of a military general. She explained that men like Julian, men who played at being tycoons while spending other people's money, were obsessed with corporate jargon. We were going to tell him that my wealth manager required a strict separation of assets before authorizing the $100,000 wire transfer. We would frame it as a necessary legal shield to protect his new booming startup from any liability associated with my design agency. Valerie pressed a button on her desk, summoning her senior paralegal. She instructed him to begin drafting the documents immediately. The agreement would be dense, packed with intimidating legal terminology, but the core function would be terrifyingly simple. It would explicitly state that InnovateSphere, Julian's Shell, LLC, was his sole and separate property. More importantly, it would include a blanket liability transfer clause. It would legally dictate that any debts, loans, mortgages, or financial obligations incurred under Julian's name, or the name of his LLC, both past and future, were his exclusive responsibility. It would completely sever my financial ties to the townhouse retroactively, making him the sole guarantor of the forged $450,000 loan. I listened to her build the trap, my heart pounding with dark, heavy anticipation. I asked what would happen if he refused to sign it, or if Tara insisted on reviewing the documents. Valerie laughed a dry, humorless sound. She told me Tara was a small-time fraudster playing at being a broker. She would not understand the lethal nuances of a corporate post-nuptial agreement. As for Julian, he was blindingly desperate for that $100,000 cash injection. Valerie leaned across the obsidian desk, her voice dropping to a low, intense register. She assured me he would sign whatever we put in front of him because his greed would completely blind him to the danger. He believed he was the smartest person in the room. We simply had to let him keep believing that until the ink dried. The paralegal returned an hour later with a thick stack of freshly printed documents. Valerie and I spent the next 2 hours going over every single line, ensuring the trap was inescapable. The contract included a specific clause revoking his access to all of my personal and business accounts, cloaked in language about maintaining clean corporate divisions for tax purposes. We buried the retroactive debt assumption in Section 4, subsection D, wrapping it in dense paragraphs about indemnification and fiduciary firewalls. It was a masterpiece of legal sabotage. It looked exactly like the kind of aggressive corporate maneuvering a successful CEO would use to protect his billion-dollar empire. It fed directly into the delusion Julian and Shirley had constructed. By signing it, he would permanently insulate my wealth from his incoming criminal prosecution. He would become legally and solely responsible for the forged mortgage, trapping himself and Tara in a federal fraud case with absolutely no way to claim I was a complicit financial partner. I signed my portion of the documents, the scratch of the expensive fountain pen echoing loudly in the quiet office. Valerie gathered the papers, slipping them into a pristine leather folder bearing the firm's intimidating logo. She handed it to me with a look of profound satisfaction. She told me to take it home to play the devoted, supportive wife one last time and to not let him leave my sight until his signature was on the dotted line. I took the heavy folder, feeling the immense, lethal weight of it in my hands. The guillotine was fully assembled, its blade sharpened to a microscopic edge. All I had to do now was politely ask my husband to place his head on the block. I thanked Valerie, my voice cool and steady, and walked out of the towering glass skyscraper into the bright afternoon sun, ready to execute the final maneuver. I was no longer just his victim. I was the absolute architect of his impending, inescapable, and meticulously planned ruin. I drove back to my house, the leather folder resting on the passenger seat beside me like a weapon. The late afternoon sun was dipping below the horizon, casting sharp shadows across the manicured lawns of my pristine neighborhood. I gripped the leather steering wheel, consciously willing my heart rate to slow down. I needed perfection. I needed to walk through my front door playing the role of a woman overwhelmed by corporate stress, devoted to her husband, and desperate to protect his brilliant future. I pulled into the garage, turned off the engine, and took a deep, steadying breath. I arranged my facial features into a mask of breathless, anxious excitement. I had texted Tara on my drive over, telling her I had spoken directly to my wealth manager. I told her I needed a massive favor from my favorite licensed notary to expedite the $100,000 wire transfer for Julian. Naturally, the promise of immediate cash was an irresistible, intoxicating lure. She had replied within seconds, promising to be at the house in 20 minutes. I grabbed the folder, stepped out of the car, and walked into the grand foyer. The house was quiet, smelling faintly of the expensive cologne Julian always wore. I called out his name, injecting a slight manufactured tremor into my voice. Julian was lounging in the living room on the custom Italian leather sectional. He was wearing casual slacks and a pristine white shirt, a glass of sparkling water resting on a coaster next to him. The television was playing a financial news network at a low volume, completing his carefully curated image of a dedicated entrepreneur taking a brief, well-deserved rest. He muted the television as I rushed into the room. I dropped my handbag onto the glass coffee table with a calculated, heavy sigh, letting my shoulders slump. I sank onto the plush cushion right next to him, pressing my face into his shoulder. He immediately wrapped his arm around me, his tone laced with that fake practice concern he used so effectively to placate me. He stroked my hair, asking me what was wrong and why I looked so frantic. I sat up, looking him directly in the eyes. I channeled every ounce of adrenaline coursing through my veins, converting my pure rage into a flawless display of panicked anxiety. I told him I had just come from an emergency high-level meeting with my executive legal team. I grabbed his hand, squeezing his fingers tightly, ensuring he felt my manufactured trembling. I told him my agency was facing a monumental shift, and I needed him to listen to me very carefully. I spun a masterful, completely fabricated story with total conviction. I explained that a massive international corporate conglomerate was aggressively looking to acquire a major stake in my design agency. I told him the initial buyout numbers were staggering, worth tens of millions of dollars, but the deal came with an immense, terrifying amount of corporate liability. I widened my eyes, letting a look of pure dread wash over my face. I told him the acquiring company was demanding a total microscopic restructuring of my personal and business assets. I said their forensic auditors were going to tear through everything, and any asset tied to my name or my marriage would be exposed to intense, aggressive federal scrutiny. I told him I was terrified. I said their brutal liability clauses could easily bleed over and completely destroy his startup. I told him I could not bear the thought of my corporate risks suffocating Innovate's fear, just as he was on the verge of securing his massive government contract. I painted a picture of ruthless corporate raiders who would seize his brilliant startup to cover my agency's potential liabilities. I begged him to understand the extreme danger my success was suddenly posing to his own hard work. Julian puffed out his chest, his posture shifting immediately. The mere suggestion that his fake startup was a highly valuable asset worth protecting fed his towering, insatiable ego perfectly. He squeezed my hand back, puffing himself up to play the role of the protective, knowledgeable patriarch. He assured me that corporate acquisitions were always messy and told me I was entirely right to be extremely cautious. Right on cue, the front doorbell chimed loudly. Tara walked in a moment later, not even bothering to knock, practically vibrating with greedy anticipation. She had clearly rushed over, her dark eyes darting immediately toward the heavy leather folder resting on my lap. I greeted her warmly, thanking her profusely for coming on such short notice. I invited her to sit down with us, explaining that I needed her professional help to safeguard her brother's financial future. I opened the leather folder, withdrawing the thick stack of dense, intimidating legal documents Valerie had prepared. I laid them out on the glass coffee table, smoothing the crisp white pages flat. I explained to Julian and Tara that my wealth manager and legal team had drafted a comprehensive business asset protection plan. I deliberately avoided the word post-nuptial, referring to the documents exclusively as a corporate firewall. I told Julian that by signing these documents, he would legally sever InnovateSphere and all his personal business dealings from my agency. I explained that it would ensure his assets, his debts, and his corporate liabilities were entirely his own, shielding him completely from any fallout if my acquisition deal went sideways. Furthermore, I added, lowering my voice to a serious whisper, this legal separation was the absolute only way my wealth manager would authorize the $100,000 wire transfer to his account by Wednesday. Julian stared at the documents. I held my breath, every muscle in my body coiled tight. If he read Section 4 carefully, if he possessed even a fraction of the business acumen he pretended to have, the entire plan would collapse. But Valerie had been absolutely right. Julian was completely blinded by his own arrogance and his unwavering assumption that I was foolish. He looked at the dense legal jargon, the endless paragraphs of indemnification clauses and fiduciary definitions, and his eyes instantly glazed over. He did not want to admit to me or to his sister that he did not understand the complex legal terminology. He wanted to appear like a seasoned executive casually reviewing standard corporate paperwork. He flipped casually through the pages, skimming the bolded headers. Tara leaned over his shoulder, her eyes fixed entirely on the final page where the notary seal belonged. She urged him to sign it quickly, reminding him that the government contract was waiting and that they needed to secure the capital immediately. She was so desperate to get her hands on my money that she was actively rushing her brother into his own financial execution. Julian nodded confidently. He pulled a silver pen from his jacket pocket. He told me he understood completely, praising me for being so proactive in protecting his empire. He placed the pen on the signature line and signed his name with a swift, arrogant flourish. He pushed the documents across the glass table toward his sister. Tara practically snatched them up. She pulled her official notary stamp from her designer handbag, her face glowing with pure, unadulterated triumph. She checked his signature, signed her own name on the witness line, and positioned her heavy stamp over the bottom of the page. She pressed down hard. The loud, wet thud of the ink hitting the paper echoed through the living room like the slamming of a prison cell door. She handed the executed documents back to me, smiling a wicked, greedy smile. She told me I had made a very smart business decision. Julian stood up and walked directly over to the home bar, pouring 2 glasses of scotch to celebrate their massive accomplishment. He handed one glass to his sister, raising his glass in a boastful toast to the future of his company. They clinked their glasses together, the crystal ringing loudly in the open room. I watched them swallow the expensive amber liquor, my expression remaining perfectly flawlessly neutral. I took the papers, feeling the slightly damp ink against my fingertips. My heart hammered a fierce, victorious rhythm against my ribs. It was done. Julian had just legally accepted total exclusive responsibility for every single fraudulent debt in his name. He had permanently severed himself from my wealth. Tara had legally verified his financial suicide, stamping her own destruction onto the very pages that would send them both to federal prison. I smiled back at them, a bright, blinding display of absolute joy. I told them they had no idea how safe I finally felt. They sat there grinning at me, completely unaware that their entire world had just effectively ended. I closed the heavy black leather folder, securely locking their doomed signatures safely away in the cold dark. The sharp blade of the guillotine had officially dropped. The guillotine had dropped. I did not sleep that night. I lay awake in the master bedroom, listening to the rhythmic breathing of the man who had dismantled my life, feeling an electric current of anticipation hum beneath my skin. When the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, I slipped out of bed, leaving Julian tangled in the duvet. I dressed with mechanical precision, grabbed the leather folder from my safe, and drove straight back to the financial district. The morning air was sharp. I arrived at Sterling and Vance before the receptionist had even poured coffee. Valerie was already waiting in her corner office, looking like a shark sensing blood. I handed her the heavy folder. She opened it, running a manicured finger over Julian's arrogant signature and Tara's fraudulent notary stamp. A chilling smile spread across Valerie's face. She confirmed the trap had shut flawlessly. Julian had legally isolated his LLC and explicitly claimed total responsibility for the massive, fraudulent debt. The agreement severed my agency from his shell but kept the paper trail proving my funds bought the townhouse. Valerie explained the glorious legal loophole we were about to exploit. Because my money had been illegally funneled through Julian's shell company to purchase the property, and because he had just signed a document separating my assets from his liabilities, I had the absolute right to place an immediate lien on the property to recover my capital. I was going to seize the townhouse. I did not want the house. I did not want to step foot inside the property where my husband had played house with his mistress and their secret toddler. I wanted it entirely liquidated, completely erased from my existence, and I wanted it done with maximum devastating collateral damage to its current occupants. I asked Valerie how fast we could legally strip the roof over their heads. Valerie steepled her fingers. She warned me that traditional sales took 30 days, involving lengthy escrow periods. Julian would absolutely notice a standard listing. He would receive notifications, and he would have time to scramble, hire an attorney, and drag out the eviction process for months. He could claim squatters' rights and hide behind the slow gears of tenant protection laws. I shook my head flatly, refusing to give him a single second to breathe. I told her I did not care about market value or recouping the full $500,000. I only cared about speed and absolute devastation. I needed a buyer who operated outside the polite norms of traditional real estate. I needed a corporate predator. Valerie nodded slowly, pulling a black business card from her desk drawer and sliding it across the obsidian surface. She told me to contact Victor Vance, a distant cousin of hers who ran an aggressive cash in 24 hours liquidation firm. They specialized in acquiring distressed assets, foreclosures, and hostile takeovers. They were ruthless, efficient, and notoriously brutal with evictions. I left Valerie's office and drove directly to the address printed on the card. It was not a gleaming skyscraper. It was a concrete building in a gritty industrial park. I parked and walked into the sterile lobby of Apex Capital Liquidations. I did not have an appointment, but when I dropped Valerie's name, I was instantly escorted into a back office. Victor sat behind a cluttered metal desk, a large man with a thick neck, wearing a dark suit that strained against his broad shoulders. He possessed the rough, predatory aura of a man who made his living profiting from other people's absolute worst days. He did not offer a drink or engage in polite small talk. He simply asked what I was selling. I opened my briefcase and placed the thick stack of property records, the forensic financial trace proving my ownership of the funds, and the freshly signed post-nuptial agreement on his desk. I told him I had a fully furnished, $500,000 luxury townhouse located in the most exclusive, gated suburb in the county. I told him I was selling it to him today entirely in cash for exactly $200,000. Victor stopped flipping through the documents. He looked up, his heavy brow furrowing in deep suspicion. He bluntly stated that nobody sells a flawless $500,000 property at a massive discount unless there is a radioactive catch. He demanded to know what was wrong with the house. Was the foundation cracked? Was there black mold? Was it an active crime scene? I maintained a flat, emotionless stare. I told him the property was in perfect structural condition. The catch, I explained, was the current occupants. I leaned across the cold metal desk, matching his predatory energy. I explained that the townhouse was currently occupied by a man and a woman who believed they owned it completely, unaware that the financial rug had just been legally pulled out from under them. I told him that I was granting him total immediate ownership of the asset at a staggering discount, but it came with one absolute non-negotiable clause. I pulled a customized contract from my briefcase, sliding it over his desk. I told Victor that by accepting the deeply discounted sale, his firm was legally bound to execute an immediate zero-notice eviction protocol by the end of this current week. I did not want a polite 30-day notice taped to the front door. I did not want a mediated exit strategy. I wanted a hostile extraction. I demanded that his firm arrive with a private armed security team and a fleet of moving trucks. I wanted the heavy mahogany front door breached the moment the legal transfer cleared. I detailed the exact parameters of the strike. The locks were to be drilled out and replaced instantly. Every piece of furniture, every designer garment, every toy, and every electronic device funded by my stolen money was to be dumped onto the street. They were to be given absolutely 0 minutes to pack bags or secure alternate lodging. Victor read through my customized clause, his thick finger tracing the aggressive legal language. A slow grin spread across his face. He chuckled. He told me he dealt with angry spouses, desperate gamblers, and ruined business partners every single day, but he had never met a woman who mapped out the total destruction of an enemy with such clinical, chilling precision. He pulled a heavy corporate checkbook from his drawer, asking me to confirm the timeline. I told him the post-nuptial agreement officially secured Julian's fate and my asset claim today. By Wednesday, Julian was expecting a $100,000 wire transfer that would never arrive. I wanted the eviction strike team to hit the townhouse on Thursday morning, perfectly synchronized with the exact moment Julian realized his entire financial empire had collapsed. I wanted him to scramble in a blind panic, only to receive a hysterical phone call from his mistress stating they had just been forcefully thrown out onto the pavement. Victor clicked a heavy gold pen, slowly writing out the staggering cash sum for the property. He slid the thick corporate check across the cold metal desk, pushing the final transfer documents toward me. He promised me that Apex Capital Liquidations specialized in exactly this brand of hostile asset recovery. He assured me his security contractors were entirely unsympathetic and highly efficient. He swore that by noon on Thursday, the occupants of that townhouse would be standing on the curb with absolutely nothing but the clothes on their backs. I picked up the heavy gold pen and signed my name on the final transfer deed, permanently signing away the luxurious fortress my cheating husband had built for his secret life. I did not feel a single ounce of regret. I took the heavy corporate check, folded it very carefully, and slipped it deep into my tailored blazer pocket. I stood up, offering Victor a firm, business-like handshake, thanking him for his highly specialized services. I walked out of the brutalist concrete building and back into the bright, sharp sunlight. The air tasted incredibly sweet. I drove back toward the city, my mind perfectly calm, visualizing the devastating domino effect I had just initiated. My money was secured. The legal trap was locked. The hostile eviction team was fully mobilized and waiting for the green light. Julian had spent 3 years building a secret parallel universe using my blood and sweat. He thought he was untouchable. He thought he could steal from me, lie to me, and manipulate me into subsidizing his treason indefinitely. He had no idea that the wealthy, compliant wife he had left at home on Sunday was officially dead. The woman driving back into the city was a completely different entity. I was the supreme architect of his absolute and devastating ruin, and on Thursday morning, I was finally going to stand by and happily watch his entire world burn completely to ash. I steered my car through the heavy late afternoon traffic, my mind shifting effortlessly from the hostile eviction protocol to the grand theatrical finale. The financial and legal traps were set, locked, and entirely inescapable, but I wanted a spectacle. I wanted a visceral, unavoidable confrontation where Julian could not hide behind his practiced charm. I needed all the players in one room trapped under bright lights and the scrutinizing gaze of high society. I picked up my phone and dialed the reservation desk at Orchidee. It was the most ostentatious, fiercely exclusive, and aggressively expensive restaurant in the entire financial district. It was the kind of establishment where the head manager evaluated your net worth before seating you. I bypassed the standard waiting list by immediately demanding the Crystal Vault. The vault was their premier private dining room, enclosed entirely in soundproof glass and suspended above the main dining floor. It offered total privacy while remaining highly visible to everyone in the restaurant. I paid the exorbitant, non-refundable deposit without a single ounce of hesitation. I ordered the grand tasting menu, the imported caviar service, and 3 bottles of their most fiercely guarded vintage champagne. I wanted the setting to scream of unimaginable wealth and absolute victory. I wanted Julian to feel like a conquering king sitting on a throne of spun sugar, completely unaware that the floor beneath him was about to give way. I arrived home to find Julian still lounging in the living room, perfectly playing the part of the exhausted startup executive. I walked in shedding my coat and offering him a blinding, adoring smile. I told him we needed to celebrate. I sat beside him, taking his hand and squeezing it with manufactured affection. I told him that signing the corporate firewall document was a monumental step forward for his company and for our marriage. I spun a masterful web of flattery, feeding his insatiable ego until he practically purred. I told him that by Wednesday evening, the $100,000 capital injection would be processing, his startup would be legally bulletproof, and my new corporate client would be completely secured. I said a milestone of this magnitude demanded a proper historic celebration. I told him I had secured the crystal vault at Orchidee for Wednesday night. Julian's eyes widened. He knew the reputation of the restaurant. He knew it was a place reserved for billionaires and industry titans. The sheer vanity of dining in the glass room above the city elite appealed directly to his deepest, most pathetic insecurities. He puffed out his chest, agreeing that his recent hard work certainly warranted a lavish reward. I did not stop there. I insisted that he invite Shirley and Tara to join us. I told him that family was everything, and that his mother and sister deserved to share in his glorious triumph. I knew perfectly well that Shirley and Tara would never pass up an opportunity to gorge themselves on free world-class food and expensive alcohol. I also mandated a strict, uncompromising dress code. I told Julian the restaurant required formal black tie attire. I wanted him in his best tailored tuxedo. I wanted Shirley and Tara dressed to the absolute nines, draped in their stolen cashmere and fake designer jewelry. I wanted them feeling incredibly powerful, entirely untouchable, and supremely arrogant. Julian immediately pulled out his phone to call his mother, his voice dripping with smug superiority as he bragged about the exclusive reservation his wealthy wife had secured for his brilliant accomplishments. I listened to him gloat, maintaining a soft, supportive smile, while internally calculating the exact moment his fragile illusion would shatter into a million jagged pieces. With the venue secured and the primary targets locked into their seats, I moved to the final, most volatile phase of my plan. Tuesday morning arrived with cold, gray skies. I left the house under the guise of running routine errands for my design agency. Instead, I drove to a rundown strip mall on the opposite side of the city. I walked into a brightly lit electronics store and paid cash for a cheap, untraceable prepaid burner phone. I bought a prepaid network card, loaded it with minimum minutes, and activated the device in the parking lot. I sat in the driver's seat of my car, staring at the blank screen, preparing to strike the final match. Jasmine was the wild card. She was the mistress, the hidden mother, the woman living in a subsidized luxury townhouse, believing she was the center of Julian's universe. I needed her desperate. I needed her angry. I needed her to crash through the doors of Orchidee like a wrecking ball. I drafted the text message with the meticulous psychological precision of a seasoned profiler. I could not sound like a jealous wife, and I could not sound like a generic threat. I needed to sound like a disgruntled, resentful insider. I posed as a friend of Julian, someone from his fabricated startup world who was disgusted by his arrogance. I typed the words slowly, ensuring every single syllable carried maximum lethal impact. I started the message by asking if she was sitting in her fancy townhouse waiting for Julian to commit. I wrote that Julian was laughing at her behind her back. I told her he had no intention of leaving his wealthy wife. I typed that he was using her to play house, keeping her completely hidden, like a dirty, embarrassing secret. I paused, letting my finger hover over the digital keyboard before delivering the absolute ultimate psychological bait. I knew Jasmine's deepest vulnerability was her son, the secret toddler she believed would secure her future with Julian's family. I continued typing the toxic narrative. I told her that Julian was hosting a massive, highly public celebration dinner on Wednesday night at Orchidee. I provided the exact address and specified the private crystal vault dining room. I wrote that the entire family would be there, including Shirley and Tara. Then I dropped the absolute heaviest weight. I typed that Julian was planning to announce his divorce to his mother that very night, and that he had promised to finally introduce his secret son to Shirley. But I added Julian was a coward. I told her he was planning to back out. I wrote that he was terrified of his wife's money and that he would never actually bring his son into the light unless his hand was completely forced. I told her that if she did not show up at that restaurant with her child, Julian would never leave his wife and she would remain a hidden, pathetic mistress forever. I framed the message as a final warning from someone who felt sorry for her profound foolishness. I read the message 3 times, checking the tone, the aggressive urgency, and the undeniable provocation. It was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. It hit every single one of her insecurities. It challenged her pride, threatened her child's future, and offered her a clear, immediate target. Jasmine was a woman who had willingly slept with a married man and happily accepted stolen funds to finance her lifestyle. She was entitled, greedy, and completely lacking in moral boundaries. She would not read that message and stay home. The sheer rage of being called a hidden secret would override any logical caution. The desperation to secure her place in Shirley's good graces would propel her directly toward the restaurant. I hit send. I watched the status indicator change to delivered. I waited exactly 60 seconds, visualizing the notification lighting up the screen of her phone inside the luxurious stolen townhouse. Then I turned the burner phone off, removed the battery, snapped the plastic casing completely in half, and dropped the shattered pieces into a commercial dumpster. The electronic trail was permanently severed. I drove back to my house feeling an electric, dangerous energy coursing through my veins. The table was set, the invitations were delivered, the guests were perfectly positioned. I spent Tuesday evening going through my closet searching for the absolute perfect armor for the impending slaughter. I bypassed the soft pastels and the accommodating, subdued dresses that Julian usually preferred. I selected a tailored, deep emerald green silk suit. It radiated cold, uncompromising authority. I paired it with silver stiletto heels and a heavy, vintage silver necklace that rested against my collarbone like chainmail. I wanted to look like an executioner, not a victim. I laid the outfit out on the velvet chaise lounge in my dressing room, admiring the sleek, lethal lines of the fabric. Julian walked past the room, pausing to compliment the suit, telling me I would look absolutely beautiful for his big celebratory night. I thanked him, offering a sweet, vacant smile, agreeing that it was going to be a night entirely impossible to forget, a night where every single one of his dark secrets would finally be dragged screaming into the unforgiving light. Wednesday evening arrived with a biting chill, but I felt absolutely impervious to the cold as I stepped out of the car in front of Orchidee. I wore the emerald green silk suit like a suit of armor. Julian walked beside me in a tailored midnight blue tuxedo, looking every inch the triumphant billionaire he believed himself to be. We were escorted directly up the glass staircase to the crystal vault. Enclosed entirely in soundproof glass, it offered a panoramic view of the bustling restaurant below. A massive chandelier of hand-blown crystal hung over a long marble table set with fine china and heavy silver flatware. Shirley and Tara were already waiting with greedy smiles. Shirley wore a garish, sequined dress that strained at the seams. Tara was poured into a tight, red cocktail dress, looking around the room as if calculating the net worth of every diner below us. They both vibrated with smug satisfaction. Julian pulled out my chair, playing the role of the devoted husband flawlessly. He then took his seat at the head of the table, ordering the sommelier to open the first bottle of vintage champagne. I watched them toast to Julian's fabricated success, their glasses clinking in a hollow, echoing chime. The first course arrived with a flourish of synchronized waiters placing delicate plates of imported caviar in front of us. Shirley scooped a massive portion onto her plate, chewing loudly, and praising Julian for finally providing the lifestyle she always deserved. She looked at me, her eyes glinting with unadulterated malice. She remarked that it was about time Julian took control of his financial destiny, adding a deeply insulting comment about how exhausting it must have been to rely on a woman's income for so long. She smiled sweetly, completely unaware of the irony of her statement. Tara chimed in, taking a large gulp of the expensive champagne, loudly agreeing with her mother. She boasted about her own real estate prowess, bragging that she and Julian were the true business minds of the family. She claimed that real wealth required aggressive risk-taking, something she implied I completely lacked. Julian leaned back in his chair, basking in their manufactured adoration. He patted my hand, resting on the table, offering a patronizing apology for his family's bluntness, but his eyes danced with victory. He genuinely thought he had won. He thought he had outsmarted me, secured his massive payday, and protected his hidden life. I smiled placidly, taking a tiny, deliberate sip of my ice water. I told Shirley I was incredibly happy to see Julian finally taking full responsibility for his own actions. The double meaning sailed completely over their heads. The waiters cleared the plates and began pouring a rich dark red wine for the second course. The heavy glass doors of the crystal vault suddenly swung open, shattering the quiet, refined atmosphere of the private room. Jasmine stormed through the entrance, her face flushed with unhinged rage. She was holding the toddler tightly on her hip, the boy staring wide-eyed at the chandelier. Jasmine looked every bit the desperate, frantic woman my burner phone message had designed her to be. The silence in the soundproof room was instantaneous. Julian froze his wine glass, halting inches from his mouth. All the color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified animal. His eyes darted frantically from Jasmine to me, to the glass doors, silently begging for an escape route that did not exist. Jasmine did not hesitate. She marched directly toward the head of the table, glaring furiously at Julian. She slammed her free hand onto the polished marble, rattling the silver cutlery. She demanded to know if this was the big family announcement he had promised. She yelled that she was entirely done being his dirty little secret. She pointed at Shirley, introducing herself as the mother of Julian's only son. She demanded her rightful place at the table, screaming that she was tired of sitting in the dark while he paraded around with a woman he planned to divorce. The toddler began to cry, the sharp sound bouncing off the glass walls. Shirley dropped her fork, her jaw unhinging in sheer, unadulterated horror. She looked at Jasmine, then at the crying child, her brain struggling to process the catastrophic collision of her son's two entirely separate lives. Tara leaped out of her chair in panic. She realized instantly that the $500,000 scam was blowing up in front of my face. Tara rushed toward Jasmine, grabbing her arm furiously, hissing at her to keep her voice down and leave immediately. She tried to physically shove Jasmine toward the doors, desperate to protect the fraudulent townhouse and the wire transfer they all believed was coming. Julian finally found his voice, sputtering incoherent syllables. He stood up, knocking his chair backward, holding his hands up in a desperate, pathetic gesture of surrender. He begged me not to listen to her, claiming Jasmine was a crazy, unstable woman who was stalking him. Jasmine shrieked at his denial, shoving Tara away and holding the toddler out toward Shirley, screaming that Julian was a coward and a liar. The chaos was absolute, a perfect, beautiful symphony of their own deceit tearing them apart. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not throw my wine in his face. I simply remained seated, watching them scramble like rats trapped in a flooding cage. I slowly stood up from the table, my emerald green suit catching the light of the chandelier. I did not raise my voice, but the sheer, icy authority in my movement commanded the room instantly. The screaming stopped. Tara froze. Jasmine clamped her mouth shut. Julian stared at me, his eyes wide with dawning terror. He realized I was not shocked or devastated. I was entirely in control. I reached down and picked up the heavy leather briefcase I had placed beside my chair. I unclasped the lock with a sharp metallic click. I calmly withdrew 3 thick, pristine manila folders. I walked slowly around the marble table, my silver heels clicking rhythmically against the floor. I stopped directly behind Julian. I tossed the first folder onto the table in front of him. It hit the marble with a heavy slap. I told him in a voice as cold as liquid nitrogen that he was right about one thing. We were definitely celebrating a milestone. I informed him that the folder contained my official petition for divorce, filed at the exact moment the courthouse opened this morning. I also pointed out the finalized legally binding copy of the corporate asset protection plan he had so eagerly signed. I explained, speaking slowly, so the reality could crush him completely, that he had explicitly legally assumed 100% of the $450,000 fraudulent mortgage debt. I told him my assets were entirely frozen, the $100,000 wire transfer never existed, and his fake startup was now a completely worthless shell drowning in criminal liabilities. I turned away from my hyperventilating husband and walked toward Tara. She was trembling, her hands shaking violently by her sides. I handed her the second manila folder. I told her she should open it. I explained that it contained a comprehensive, undeniable fraud report submitted directly to the State Real Estate Board and the District Attorney's Office. I detailed exactly how my forensic accountant had tracked the forged power of attorney and her illegal notary stamp. I told her the federal authorities already possessed the original documents, and her lucrative, easy career was permanently over. I watched the realization of her impending incarceration wash over her face, draining away every ounce of her former arrogance. She collapsed into her chair, gasping for air. Finally, I turned my strict attention to Shirley. She was clutching her chest, staring at me with a mixture of hatred and absolute disbelief. I dropped the third and final heavy manila folder directly onto her pristine porcelain plate. I told her to open it and look closely at the undeniable contents. I explained it was a meticulously itemized microscopic receipt of every single dollar I had personally spent keeping her afloat for the last decade. I verbally listed the mortgage payments, the car leases, the medical bills, and the lavish vacations she had claimed Julian provided. I leaned in close, resting my hands on the table, forcing her to look into my eyes. I told her that her precious, industrious son was completely broke. He had never paid for a single thing in her entire life. He was nothing but an empty, pathetic fraud, living entirely off my hard work and success. I informed her that she was currently looking at a man who was facing massive federal fraud charges and that the bank would be seizing her heavily subsidized assets and vehicles by the very end of the month. I looked around the silent, thoroughly shattered room, quietly absorbing the total, absolute devastation I had meticulously orchestrated from the very beginning. The grand theatrical execution of my master plan was finally complete, and I had finally won. The suffocating silence in the crystal vault was finally broken by Jasmine. She stared at the manila folders, then at Julian's ashen, terrified face, and the reality of his absolute destitution finally registered in her greedy mind. She adjusted the crying toddler on her hip, her voice shrill and demanding. She ordered Julian to get up immediately. She told him to leave this crazy woman and her insane legal papers behind, demanding he take her back to their townhouse where they belonged. She insisted they pack their things and figure out a plan together, away from my toxic family. I turned my gaze slowly toward Jasmine. The sheer entitlement radiating from her was almost breathtaking. I offered her a soft, dangerously calm smile. I told her that she was not going to like her plan very much. I explained, speaking with deliberate, terrifying clarity, that the luxurious townhouse she had been living in was purchased entirely with funds Julian had stolen from me. I told her that because my husband had so graciously signed a post-nuptial agreement, legally severing my assets from his crimes, I was able to place an immediate, indisputable lien on the property. Jasmine blinked, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to comprehend the legal reality bearing down on her. Julian buried his face in his hands, letting out a low, pathetic moan of pure defeat. I continued, raising my voice just enough to ensure every single person in the glass room heard the final judgment. I informed Jasmine that I had officially sold the townhouse yesterday afternoon to a highly aggressive cash-only liquidation firm. I told her the new owners did not care about her child, her relationship drama, or her complete lack of preparation. I leaned forward, locking eyes with the mistress who had thought she could casually steal my life. I told her that a private armed eviction crew was scheduled to arrive at the property at exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. I explained they were going to drill the locks, breach the front door, and throw every single piece of designer clothing, furniture, and stolen luxury directly onto the sidewalk. I advised her that she had less than 14 hours to pack up whatever miserable scraps belonged to her before she was forcefully and permanently removed from the premises. Jasmine let out a sharp, hysterical gasp, clutching the toddler tightly against her chest as the devastating reality of her impending homelessness crashed over her. Shirley began to hyperventilate, clutching her chest, while Tara remained entirely frozen in her chair, staring blankly at the fraud report that had just ended her career. I smoothed the front of my emerald green silk suit, feeling completely flawless. I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out the heavy leather billfold the waiter had discreetly dropped off earlier. The grand tasting menu, the imported caviar, and the 3 bottles of vintage champagne totaled exactly $4,000. I tossed the leather folder directly onto Julian's lap. I told him he was the successful, wealthy entrepreneur of the family, so he could handle the celebratory dinner check. I reached for my left hand and slowly twisted the diamond wedding band off my finger. I held it up to the light of the crystal chandelier for a brief second, admiring the sparkle, before dropping it directly into Julian's glass of ice water. It sank to the bottom with a quiet, dismissive clink. I did not say another word. I turned on my silver stiletto heels and walked out of the soundproof glass room, leaving them all drowning in the wreckage of their own deceit, and stepped out into the cool, liberating night air. 6 months later, the dust from the explosion had completely settled, leaving a vastly different landscape in its wake. The federal authorities had moved with terrifying speed once they received the meticulously documented fraud dossier. Julian's entire fabricated empire collapsed instantly. The bank seized his frozen accounts, and the phantom startup dissolved into a mountain of unserviceable debt. Stripped of my wealth and facing severe federal indictment for wire fraud and identity theft, he was forced to declare total bankruptcy. Last I heard, my former husband was living in a cheap, rundown motel on the outskirts of the city awaiting his criminal trial, while Jasmine and her son vanished, entirely refusing to answer his desperate calls. Tara's arrogant real estate reign ended just as brutally. The state board permanently revoked both her broker and notary licenses within a week of reviewing the forged documents. The district attorney aggressively pursued the case, and she was currently facing up to 5 years in a federal penitentiary for her role in the mortgage scam. Shirley's subsidized, luxurious existence evaporated overnight. With her son facing prison and my financial pipeline permanently severed, she lost her leased vehicles and her upscale apartment. Reality finally caught up to her entitlement. The woman who had constantly mocked my career and called me barren was now working a grueling minimum wage job as a greeter at a local discount store, forced to stand on her feet all day just to afford a tiny studio apartment. As for me, I sold the large suburban house and upgraded my life completely. I purchased a stunning, ultra-modern penthouse overlooking the very heart of the city skyline. My design agency doubled its revenue, landing the massive corporate contract I had used as bait for my former husband. I sit on my private balcony this evening, wrapped in a plush robe, sipping a glass of my favorite vintage Pinot Noir. The city lights glitter beautifully below me. The air is quiet, calm, and perfectly serene. They called me cold. But sometimes the greatest act of self-love is letting parasites drown in their own mess. Have you ever had to bring the receipts to cut off a toxic family? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe.